Honey, I'm home.
What happened to you?
There is a moment in every marriage, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, where one person looks at the other and realizes they are not entirely sure who they are looking at. Not because the face has changed, not because anything dramatic has happened, but because something small and almost invisible has shifted, and the person who built their entire life around certainty suddenly finds themselves standing in a room full of questions they don't know how to ask. That moment is where this story begins. Not with a crime, not with a scandal, but with a man sitting across a breakfast table, watching his wife stir her coffee, and feeling, for the first time in 20 years of navigating the most ruthless boardrooms in America, completely and utterly afraid. His name was Marcus Hale, 52 years old, born in Dayton, Ohio, to a mechanic father and a school cafeteria worker mother. Worth, at the time this story begins, $4.2 billion. Not inherited, not stumbled into. Built, brick by brutal brick, across 3 decades of 18-hour days, calculated risks, and a mind that processed the world like a machine designed specifically to find the one thing everyone else had missed. Marcus Hale had never lost. Not in business, not in negotiations, not in the quiet wars that play out between powerful men in conference rooms and courtrooms and private clubs where the real decisions get made. He had never lost, and he had built his entire identity around that fact. He could see everything, every smile, every whispered phone call, every lie, but she didn't know that, because for 6 months, he pretended he couldn't see it all. Marcus Hale was worth $4.2 billion. He had everything a man could want, except the one thing money can't buy, certainty. Was his wife with him because she loved him or because of what he was worth? So he made a choice that would either save his marriage or destroy it forever. And what his wife did next, nobody, not his lawyers, not his family, not even his closest friends, saw it coming. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Diane Castillo Hale, 43 years old, San Antonio born and raised. The daughter of a woman who worked 2 jobs and never once complained about it, which meant Diane grew up understanding 2 things with absolute clarity. That dignity is not something you wait for someone else to hand you, and that the people who love you hardest are often the ones who say the least. She had put herself through college, built her own interior design consultancy in Los Angeles through her late 20s and 30s, and arrived at the day she met Marcus Hale as a woman who did not need rescuing. That part matters. That part is everything. Because the easiest version of this story, the version the internet would eventually reach for, is the one where Diane is simply a woman who married money and then reached for more of it. But that version is wrong. And by the time this story is over, you will understand exactly how wrong it is. They met at a charity gala in Malibu in the spring of 2017. Marcus, by his own later account, had not wanted to attend. He'd been to 100 of those events, sat through 100 of those conversations, smiled through 100 of those handshakes, and gone home feeling less connected to the world than when he arrived. But a business associate had insisted, and Marcus, who had built his fortune partly by knowing when to defer to other people's instincts, had gone. Diane was there for a different reason. A nonprofit she had been quietly volunteering with for 3 years was being honored that evening, and she was there to support them. They ended up seated at the same table. By the end of the night, Marcus Hale, a man who had not been surprised by anything in longer than he could remember, was surprised. He told his attorney Robert Garfield about her the following morning. He said, and Garfield would later recall this clearly, she was the first person in years who talked to him like he was just a person. Diane texted her sister from the car on the way home. The message, which would later surface, read, "I met someone tonight. He's different. I can't explain it. He just feels real." 14 months later, they were married. Small ceremony. Pacific Ocean backdrop. People who knew them both said it looked like two people who had arrived somewhere they had been trying to get to for a very long time. Marcus, 52, was marrying for the second time. His first marriage had ended in his late 30s. No children, no dramatic collapse, just the slow erosion that happens when two people spend long enough prioritizing everything except each other. He had spent over a decade alone after that, and anyone who knew him well enough to say so would tell you that the aloneness had settled into him in ways that success couldn't touch. Diane, 43, had never been married before. She had come close once, in her early 30s, but had walked away from it for reasons she kept largely private. She had spent the years since building something of her own, and she had arrived at that wedding on the California coast as someone who understood, with the clarity that only comes from having said no to the wrong thing, exactly what she was saying yes to. For nearly 2 years, by most accounts, it worked. People who attended dinners at their Newport Beach estate described a couple who seemed genuinely at ease with each other, not performatively in love, not the kind of couple who make a point of touching each other in public to signal something, but comfortable, interested in each other. The kind of ease that is actually hard to fake and harder still to manufacture if the foundation isn't real. Marcus, colleagues noted, seemed lighter than he had in years. He laughed more in meetings. He was still sharp, still relentless, still the version of himself that had built an empire, but there was something in him that had unclenched. Diane, meanwhile, had begun quietly working on a project that would eventually become the most important thing she'd ever done. She hadn't told Marcus about it yet. She was still in the planning stages. She wanted it to be hers before she shared it. That decision, to build something privately, to hold something close before offering it, would later be used against her in ways that were both deeply unfair and entirely predictable. But we'll get to that. The first cracks, when they appeared, were the kind that are almost invisible unless you are the person doing the watching. And Marcus Hale, above all things, was a person who watched. Here is what you need to understand about Marcus Hale before this story goes any further. He did not become worth $4.2 billion by being lucky. He became worth $4.2 billion by being right, consistently, in situations where most other people were wrong. His particular genius, the thing that set him apart from the other sharp minds in his industry, was pattern recognition. The ability to look at a landscape of data and noise and confusion and find the single thread that, if you pulled it, changed everything. He had done it in markets. He had done it in negotiations. He had done it in the reading of people, which is a skill so undervalued in the business world and so central to how that world actually operates. He could walk into a room and within minutes understand the dynamics of power, the points of vulnerability, the things that were being said and the things that were being carefully not said. It was not supernatural. It was the product of a childhood spent in close quarters with a father who worked long hours and came home exhausted and needed to be read carefully, and decades of professional experience that had sharpened that childhood skill into something approaching art. Which is why, when the pattern changed in late 2018, Marcus Hale noticed. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way you notice when someone lies to your face or takes something that doesn't belong to them. In the other way. The quiet way. The way a room sounds slightly different when a piece of furniture has been moved 2 inches to the left. Nothing you could point to. Nothing that would hold up in any court or any conversation. Just a difference in the frequency of a life he knew very well, and the particular discomfort of a mind that had been trained to take differences seriously. Diane was spending more time away from the house. The explanations were reasonable. Client meetings, a friend's weekend, a visit to her mother in San Antonio. Marcus did not interrogate any of it. He filed it. He began, almost involuntarily, doing what he had always done, watching, cataloging, looking for the thread. And the more he watched, the more something in him that he did not entirely want to name began to make itself known. This story is going to ask you 3 questions before it's finished. The first is this: When the person you love most in the world changes in ways too small to articulate, is the right response to ask them directly or to watch and wait and gather evidence? The second question is this. If you discovered your partner was secretly moving significant sums of money and meeting regularly with someone you didn't know, what would you assume, and would you be right? And the third question is the one that will stay with you long after this video ends. It is not about Marcus and Diane specifically. It is about all of us. When we test the people we love, and we all do it in small ways and large ways, consciously and unconsciously, what are we actually testing? Are we testing them, or are we testing ourselves? Hold those questions, because the answers are not what anyone expected. Not Marcus, not Diane, not the attorneys and the therapists and the journalists who would later pick through the wreckage of this story looking for a villain and find something considerably more complicated. In the town of Newport Beach, California, in the winter of 2019, a man worth $4.2 billion made a decision that would take 6 months to play out and years to fully understand. He decided to go blind. On purpose. In secret. And in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would change his marriage, redefine his understanding of himself, and ultimately produce something nobody, least of all Marcus Hale, could have predicted. Something that still exists today. Something real and lasting and good. But we are nowhere near that part of the story yet. We have to start where it actually started. In the fear. Marcus Hale was born in 1967 in Dayton, Ohio, the eldest of 3 children. His father, Raymond, worked at a GM assembly plant for 31 years, not because he loved it, but because it was reliable, and reliability was the highest value in the Hale household. Raymond was a quiet man in the way that men of his generation and circumstance were often quiet, not cold, not distant in the emotional sense, but economical. He did not waste words. He did not dramatize. He fixed what was broken, worked what needed working, and came home. Marcus's mother, Patricia, was the emotional center of the house, warm, perceptive, the kind of woman who could tell which of her children was upset from the sound of their footsteps on the stairs. Marcus has spoken publicly about her exactly once, in a 2014 interview with a business publication, and what he said was this: "My mother taught me that paying close attention to people is a form of love." He meant it as a tribute. Looking back now, it is hard not to see it as the seed of everything that would later go wrong. Marcus was a serious student. Not in the grinding, anxious way, but in the genuinely interested way, which is a different thing entirely. He read constantly. He asked questions that made his teachers pause. He had a particular fascination with systems, how things connected, how a change in one variable rippled through everything else, how understanding the architecture of a thing gave you leverage over it that pure effort never could. He won a partial academic scholarship to Ohio State, graduated near the top of his class in finance, and moved to Chicago at 23 with essentially nothing except the kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from having been right enough times to trust your own judgment. He spent his 20s in investment banking, brutal hours, brutal culture, everything that era of finance was, and came out the other side with 2 things: a reputation as someone who consistently saw what others missed, and a marriage that had not survived the process of becoming that person. Her name was Sandra. They had met in college, married at 27, and by 38 were living in the same house in the sense that they both slept there and not much else. Marcus would later describe that marriage, in conversation with his therapist, as 2 people who had made a sincere promise to each other and then spent the next decade prioritizing everything except the keeping of it. There was no betrayal. There was no dramatic collapse. There was simply the slow, grinding erosion of 2 people who had grown in different directions and had not paid close enough attention to notice until the distance was too great to bridge. The divorce was quiet, civil, and, by Marcus's own account, one of the most clarifying experiences of his life. Not because it freed him, but because it showed him something about himself that he had not wanted to see. that he was better at building things than at tending them, better at acquiring than at maintaining, that his particular gifts, the ones that made him extraordinary in business, made him something considerably more complicated in a life. He spent his 40s alone, mostly by choice. He had relationships. He was 52, not a monk, but nothing that took root. He was, by this point, extraordinarily wealthy, extraordinarily successful, and possessed of the specific loneliness that attaches itself to people who have achieved everything they set out to achieve and find that the achievement, while real and earned, does not fill the particular space they had hoped it would fill. He traveled. He worked. He read. He collected first edition books, which his Newport Beach estate housed in a library that visitors invariably described as one of the most beautiful rooms they had ever been in. And in the spring of 2017, at a charity gala in Malibu that he had not wanted to attend, he sat across a table from a woman named Diane Castillo, and something in him, the part that had been very carefully managed and very deliberately protected for a very long time, moved. Diane Castillo grew up in San Antonio, Texas, the daughter of Elena Castillo, a woman who worked as a medical receptionist during the day and cleaned offices 3 evenings a week, and who raised her daughter alone from the time Diane was 7 years old. Diane's father left in circumstances that Diane has never discussed publicly and that this story will not speculate about, except to say that his absence shaped her in ways that are entirely relevant to everything that follows. She grew up understanding that the people you count on can leave. She grew up watching her mother absorb that reality with a dignity so complete it never looked like suffering, even when it clearly was. She grew up, by her own later account, determined to become a person who did not need to be saved, not in a bitter way, not as a wound that calcified into armor, but as a genuine, deeply held conviction that self-sufficiency was a form of self-respect, and that anything she built with her own hands would be hers in a way that nothing handed to her ever could be. She was a gifted student, earned a full scholarship to the University of Texas at San Antonio, and graduated with a degree in interior design that her mother had driven 4 hours to watch her receive. She moved to Los Angeles at 25, spent 3 years working for an established design firm, and at 28 launched her own consultancy out of a 1-bedroom apartment in Silver Lake with a second-hand laptop and a client list she had built entirely through word of mouth. By her mid-30s, the consultancy was doing well enough that she had hired 2 part-time employees and was turning down more work than she was taking. She was not wealthy, not by any standard that the circles Marcus moved in would recognize, but she was independent, and that independence was something she had built herself, and it meant everything to her. She had come close to marriage once, at 31, with a man named Thomas who was good and kind and wanted the kind of settled, rooted life that Diane could see the appeal of but could not quite commit to. The relationship ended without cruelty, and Diane did not spend long years regretting it. She moved forward in the way that characterized her generally, not by suppressing what she felt, but by feeling it and then deciding what to do next. She had friends who loved her, a mother she spoke to 3 times a week, a career she was proud of, and a life that was, by any honest measure, a good one. She was not waiting for a billionaire. She was not waiting for anyone. And then one evening in Malibu, she sat across a table from Marcus Hale, and he asked her a question about a nonprofit she cared about, and he actually listened to the answer. Not in the way powerful men sometimes listen to women at events, which is to say not at all, but actually listened, leaning forward slightly, following up, interested, and she thought, this one is different. She was right about that. She just didn't yet know in all the ways she was right. Their courtship was, by the accounts of people close to both of them, genuinely romantic in the old-fashioned sense. Not grand gestures. Marcus was not a grand gesture man, but consistent, attentive, the kind of romantic investment that looks ordinary and is in fact the hardest kind to sustain. He called when he said he would call. He remembered what she told him. He showed up. For a man of his resources and his schedule and his history of prioritizing work above almost everything else, this was, those who knew him said, remarkable. On Diane's side, the change was equally visible. She was more settled, more at ease. The particular alertness she had always carried, the antenna that was always up, always reading the room, always prepared, seemed to quiet in his presence. Her sister later said, she laughed differently around him. Easier, like she'd put something down. They were married on the California coast in the summer of 2018. 50 guests. No press. A ceremony that people who attended would describe for years afterward as one of the most genuine they had ever witnessed. Marcus cried. Nobody who knew him had ever seen him cry. He did not look embarrassed about it. Diane held his hand through the vows and did not look away from him once. For almost a year, by every account, they were happy. And then, in the way of things, the happiness began to develop a hairline fracture so fine that only someone looking for it could have seen it. And Marcus Hale, the man who had built his entire career on looking for exactly those fractures, was, unfortunately, always looking. By the autumn of 2018, Marcus had been married to Diane for approximately 4 months. The honeymoon phase, as it is politely called, that initial period where the warmth of the new thing covers everything and the ordinary frictions of two lives combining have not yet fully surfaced, was settling into something more ordinary. Not worse, just ordinary, which is what love actually looks like when it's real, and which is something Marcus Hale had almost no experience with, which is a fact that matters enormously to understanding what happened next. The first thing he noticed was the phone. Diane had always been relatively private with her phone. She was a person who valued her independence, who had always maintained clear lines between her personal life and her professional life, and who did not feel that being married meant dissolving those lines. Marcus understood this intellectually. Emotionally, for a man whose pattern recognition instincts were always running in the background, the frequency with which she turned the screen away from him or stepped out of the room to take calls, or replied to messages with a particular focus and then set the phone face down, registered as a data point. Not an accusation, just a data point, which he filed. The second thing was the schedule. Diane's work required her to be out of the house regularly. Client meetings, site visits, supplier consultations. This had been true before they married. It was true after. But Marcus, with the obsessive attention to baseline behavior that characterized everything he did, noticed that the frequency had increased. Not dramatically, not in a way that any reasonable person would have flagged as suspicious, but more than before. And the explanations, when he asked about them, casual, curious, not interrogating, or at least trying not to, were, he felt, slightly less specific than they had previously been. Slightly more general. Where before she might have said she was meeting a specific client about a specific project at a specific location, now she was more likely to say she had meetings. The difference was small. It was the kind of difference that exists between information and the absence of information, and Marcus Hale was constitutionally incapable of not noticing it. He told himself, for several months, that he was being paranoid. He had been alone for a long time. He was not, by training or temperament, someone who was accustomed to trusting another person with any significant portion of his life. And trust, real trust, the kind that does not demand constant verification, was a skill he had not had much occasion to develop. He was probably projecting. He was probably turning ordinary privacy into suspicious behavior because his brain was wired to find patterns in noise. And sometimes the noise was just noise. He told himself this. He mostly believed it. But the data points kept accumulating, and the part of him that had never been wrong about a pattern in 30 years of professional life was quietly, insistently, impossible to silence. In November of 2018, he did something he was not proud of. He hired a private investigator, a man named Gerald Cross, who came highly recommended by Marcus's attorney Robert Garfield. who had used him for corporate matters but confirmed he handled personal investigations as well with complete discretion. Marcus gave Gerald Cross 3 weeks, a significant retainer, and a clear brief. He wanted to know if his wife was meeting anyone she hadn't told him about, and he wanted to know where the money was going. Because by November, the financial dimension had entered the picture. Marcus had access to detailed records of their joint accounts and a general but not granular view of Diane's personal finances, which she had maintained separately and which, under their prenuptial agreement, she was entirely entitled to maintain. What he had noticed, through the information he did have access to, was a pattern of withdrawals and transfers that was incrementally larger than the previous year's pattern. Not alarming, not dramatic, but different. And different, for Marcus, was never just different. Gerald Cross came back after 3 weeks with a report that was, by any measure, inconclusive. Diane had met with clients. She had attended the meetings she had described. She had visited her mother in San Antonio for a long weekend. She had coffee twice at a Santa Monica cafe with a man Cross had identified as Daniel Reyes, 37 years old, former architect, currently in the early stages of launching an independent design firm. The meetings had been brief, under an hour each time. They had talked, laughed, shaken hands on parting. Nothing that looked like anything other than two professionals who knew each other and were probably discussing something work-related. The financial transfers, Cross reported, appeared to be going to accounts he had not been able to fully trace within the scope of the engagement, but nothing he had found suggested anything obviously irregular. Marcus paid him, thanked him, and filed the report in the back of his mind next to everything else he had been filing. And then he did nothing with it for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sitting with the discomfort of not knowing, which was, for Marcus Hale, its own particular form of suffering. He was not a man built for uncertainty. He was not built for the space between suspicion and evidence, between feeling something is wrong and being able to point to the specific wrongness. He functioned by knowing, by understanding the full architecture of a thing. And here he was, in his own marriage, unable to see clearly, unable to trust what he saw when he tried, unable. And this is the thing that would not leave him alone. To simply ask his wife what was going on, because asking would mean acknowledging the fear, and acknowledging the fear would mean acknowledging that beneath all the success and the certainty and the practiced control, Marcus Hale was afraid of exactly one thing: that someone he loved would leave him, not for another person, not for money, but because of who he fundamentally was. It was in January of 2019 that the idea arrived. He has never, in any account he has given, described it as a good idea. He has described it as an inevitable idea, the kind of solution that presents itself to a particular kind of mind in a particular kind of desperation, and which seems, in the moment of its arrival, like the only possible way to know for certain. The idea was this: he would become, for a period of time, entirely dependent. He would simulate a condition that removed his agency and his power and his ability to function independently, and he would watch, carefully, without being detected, what the person closest to him did in response. The test had begun, and Marcus Hale, watching his wife cry through eyes that worked perfectly, wrote in his journal that night a single sentence that suggests, in retrospect, that some part of him had already understood what kind of man this plan revealed him to be. The sentence was, "God, I hope I'm wrong about her." He was about to find out. The first month of Marcus's performance, February into early March of 2019, was, by his own later account, the most psychologically disorienting period of his adult life. Not because the performance was difficult to maintain. He was a disciplined man and had prepared carefully, and Diane, who had no reason to suspect anything other than what she had been told, did not test the performance in ways that threatened to break it. What made the first month disorienting was something considerably more uncomfortable. Diane was extraordinary. From the first week, she reorganized the house in ways that anticipated needs Marcus had not yet expressed. She labeled every drawer in the kitchen with small adhesive tactile markers that he could feel in the dark. She learned, quickly and without making a production of it, to describe rooms aloud when they entered them, not in a loud, helpful volunteer way, but naturally, conversationally, as though she were simply sharing what she noticed. She changed the way she moved around him, creating a kind of spatial awareness in her own behavior that kept her within arm's reach without crowding him, available without hovering. She turned down 3 client contracts in the first month that would have required her to travel. She did not announce this. He found out through the household staff. When he mentioned it, carefully, in character, suggesting that she shouldn't let his situation affect her work, she said, with a matter-of-factness that made it impossible to argue with, "Your situation affects our life. That's different from my work. Both things matter. I can manage both. But right now, you're adjusting, and I'd rather be here." She read to him in the evenings. History, mostly. She had learned his preference, and occasionally long-form journalism from publications he had subscribed to for years. She did not read in a performed way, not the reading to the infirm register that can feel condescending even when it is kindly meant. She read the way someone reads when they are also interested in what they are reading, pausing to comment, to ask what he thought, to argue occasionally about interpretations. It was, Marcus wrote in his journal in early March, better than it had been before. He had not expected that. He had not expected that removing his ability to see her would somehow sharpen his ability to hear her, to attend to her in a way that the noise of ordinary sighted interaction had perhaps covered over. He wrote, on March 14th, "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was never about her. Maybe it was always about me." He did not stop, because Marcus Hale, above all things, was a man who completed what he started, and because the part of him that had initiated this was not yet satisfied. It had wanted evidence. It had not yet received it. And then, in the second month, it did. The shifts in Diane's behavior in March were not dramatic. They were, again, the kind of thing that only the most watchful observer would have catalogued as meaningful. She began spending more time out of the house again. The pattern that had originally concerned Marcus reasserted itself, now operating against the backdrop of a husband who was supposedly unable to see anything. The explanations remained plausible. But Marcus, whose position now required him to perform helplessness while actually watching everything, began to notice things that his private investigator had not been positioned to catch. The financial transfers he had previously noted began to increase. He had access to transfer notifications through the estate's financial management system, a system Diane knew existed but perhaps did not know he could monitor from his phone in real time. The amounts were not dramatic. $3,000 here, $5,000 there. But the frequency was increasing, and the receiving account he had his financial team investigate quietly was one he had not previously seen associated with Diane's normal expenditures. By the end of March, the total transferred had exceeded $40,000. By mid-April, it was approaching 60. And then there was Daniel Reyes. Marcus had not forgotten the name from Gerald Cross's report. He had his team run a more detailed background on Reyes in late March, framed as due diligence on a potential business contact of Diane's that Marcus wanted to understand for tax planning purposes, an explanation plausible enough that no one questioned it. What came back was this: Daniel Reyes, 37, formerly of a well-regarded architectural firm in Los Angeles, had separated from that firm in mid-2018 and filed the paperwork for an independent practice in January of 2019. He had, at the time of the inquiry, no significant clients on record. He had no significant personal wealth. He had recently signed a lease on a modest office space in Culver City. He was, by every available measure, a talented professional at the very beginning of a significant professional risk. And Diane was meeting him regularly, transferring substantial sums to an account Marcus couldn't immediately trace, and doing all of it in the margins of a life shared with a husband she believed could no longer see. Let that sit with you for a moment. Because the picture this paints, if you are Marcus Hale and you are watching it assemble itself through the darkened lenses of your performance, is a very specific picture. A wife who claims to be devoted to her newly disabled husband. A younger man with a professional connection to her field. Significant and increasing sums of money moving in a direction she has chosen not to disclose. It is the picture of betrayal. It is exactly the picture Marcus's fear had always expected to see. And seeing it should have felt like validation. He had been right. His instincts had been correct. His decision to run the test was justified. But what Marcus actually wrote in his journal on the night, he confirmed the financial transfers was not triumph. It was something that reads, in the context of what we now know, as almost unbearably close to grief. He wrote, "I don't want to be right about this. I have never, in my entire life, wanted so badly to be wrong." He continued the performance. April arrived. The transfers continued. Diane continued meeting with Daniel Reyes. Marcus now had someone watching those meetings, again through intermediaries, again at a remove that maintained his plausible ignorance. The meetings looked professional, but professional was not the same as transparent. And the secrecy, the sustained, deliberate, apparently conscious secrecy, was the thing Marcus could not get past. Not the money, not the meetings, the secrecy. Because Diane knew their finances well enough to know that the transfers would eventually register. She had chosen to make them anyway, which meant she had decided the secrecy was worth the risk. And the question of why, the question that would eventually tear through every assumption Marcus had made and replace them with something he had never considered, was the question he was not yet in a position to answer. In April, Marcus hosted a dinner party. 12 guests. A mix of close friends and professional associates, people who had known both him and Diane for years. He sat at the head of his own table in dark glasses, navigating with the particular careful competence of someone adjusted to recent vision loss, and he watched. He watched Diane moving through the room, gracious, warm, the precise degree of attentive toward him that read as devoted without reading as burdened. He watched his guests watching her. And what he saw in the faces of people he had known for decades, people who were his friends, who had attended his wedding, who had raised glasses to his and Diane's future, what he saw was something he had not anticipated. Some of them knew. Not everything, but something. He could see it in the quality of their attention toward Diane, the slightly too careful neutrality, the conversations that paused fractionally when she entered earshot, the eye contact between two guests at the far end of the table that crossed in a way that carried weight. These were his friends. They had seen or heard or suspected something they had chosen not to tell him. Because they believed, looking at the man in the dark glasses at the head of the table, that he could not handle it. Marcus sat through that dinner with perfect composure. He laughed at the right moments. He engaged in the right conversations. He performed, flawlessly, the role he had constructed. And inside the performance, he felt something he had not felt since he was a small boy in Dayton, Ohio, reading his father's expression from across the room and trying to determine, with the acuity of a child who has learned that accurate reading means safe passage, he felt completely, catastrophically alone. He wrote in his journal that night, "I built this situation to find out who she really is. What I found instead is what I have made of myself. I don't know how to come back from this. I don't know if I can." He kept going. May arrived. The transfers reached $100,000. Diane made 2 more trips to San Antonio. She turned down another client contract, a significant one, the kind she would not normally have let pass. She spent more evenings at home, near him, attentive. June. The transfers had passed $140,000. Marcus's financial team had now traced the receiving account to a formation, a legal entity, recently registered in California, with Diane listed as one of 4 principals. The other 3 names were a social worker, a nonprofit attorney, and a community housing advocate. Marcus did not yet understand what this meant. He filed it. He kept watching. He was tired. He had been performing, without interruption, for 4 months. He had been alone inside the performance for 4 months. He had been watching his wife tend to him with patience and consistency and something that looked from every angle like love, while also watching her do something in secret that she had chosen not to share with him, and the two things would not reconcile in any framework he had. He was a man who had built his life on the certainty of his own judgment, and his judgment, for the first time in his memory, had nothing to offer him except the exhaustion of sustained uncertainty. July arrived. 2 weeks into July, Marcus woke on a Sunday morning and made a decision. Not because he had gathered enough evidence, not because his attorney had advised him to move, but because he was tired of pretending. He was tired in the particular way of a person who has been holding a position so long that the holding of it has become the injury, and the only way to heal is to let go. He called Robert Garfield at 7 in the morning. He said, "It's over. I'm going to tell her today." Garfield, who had known about the plan from the beginning and had quietly, professionally refrained from telling Marcus what he thought of it, said only, "All right. Do you want me there?" Marcus said, "No. This part one have to do myself." He got dressed. No white cane. No dark glasses. He stood in front of the mirror in his bathroom for a long moment, looking at the reflection of a man who had spent 5.5 months pretending to be someone diminished, and found, looking back at him, not the powerful, controlled person he had always understood himself to be, just a man who was about to have the most important conversation of his life. He walked downstairs. He walked into the kitchen. Diane was at the counter. Her back was to him. She was looking at her phone, one hand wrapped around a coffee cup, relaxed in the easy way of a Sunday morning. She turned. She looked at him. She saw his face, unobscured, eyes visible, no glasses. And she was still. Marcus opened his mouth. Diane said, "Read the letter first." She gestured toward the kitchen counter. There was an envelope there that he had not seen before. His name, written in her handwriting. She turned back to the window. He stood in the kitchen holding the envelope, understanding, from something in the quality of the silence, that what was inside it was going to change everything. He was right, though not in the way he had expected. Marcus Hale took the letter to his study. He closed the door. He sat in the chair he had sat in for 30 years of decisions, and he opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages. Handwritten. He read it twice before he moved. The first time quickly, the way you read something when your eyes are moving faster than your comprehension because you need to know how it ends. The second time slowly, sitting with each page, reading it the way it was written. The letter began, "I see you." Not as a metaphor. "I see you, Marcus. I have seen you for 3 months. I know about the glasses. I know you can see. I know you have been watching me since February. And before you say anything, before you explain or defend or apologize, I need you to read what follows, because I have been waiting a long time to say it, and I want to say it in a way that I can stand behind permanently, not in the heat of a conversation where things get said that can't be unsaid." She wrote about the day he told her. The Tuesday evening in the living room with the Pacific behind him. She wrote about believing him completely and what that belief had felt like, the particular grief of watching someone you love describe a loss they haven't yet fully experienced. She wrote about calling her mother that night, after he was asleep, and crying in the bathroom with the water running so he wouldn't hear. She wrote about the reorganization of the kitchen, the tactile labels, not as a strategic choice, but as the natural reflex of a person who, when someone they love loses something, immediately begins thinking about how to compensate for it. She wrote, "I didn't do those things because I was performing a devoted wife. I did them because they were the obvious things to do, because you were my husband and you needed them." She wrote about the coffee cup, the thing that had revealed everything. A Sunday in April, early morning. She had set her coffee on the left side of his desk and left the room briefly. When she returned, it had moved, precisely, without any of the uncertain, searching motion of someone unable to see, to the right side of the desk, where Marcus always kept his coffee. She had stood there for a moment with the specific stillness of a person fitting the last piece of a puzzle into place. Then she had picked up her coffee, and said nothing, and gone about her morning. She wrote, I thought about confronting you. Every day for 3 months, I thought about it. I want you to understand why I didn't. It wasn't passivity. It wasn't fear. It was this: you needed to test me. That's a fact I had to sit with. The man I married, a man I believed was good and capable of love, needed to construct an elaborate lie in order to feel safe enough to trust me. That's not a small thing. That's not something I could be angry about. Not fully. Not without also being heartbroken on your behalf. Because a person who needs to do that is a person in significant pain. And I was not willing to abandon a person in significant pain just because the way they were expressing it was aimed at me. She wrote about the foundation. All of it. Every transfer, every meeting with Daniel Reyes, the architectural plans, the legal filings, the 4 principals she had partnered with, a social worker named Keisha Morris, a nonprofit attorney named Barbara Ewan, a community housing advocate named Sandra Porter. She explained what they were building: a transitional housing foundation for women leaving domestic abuse situations, offering not just shelter, but supported transition, job placement assistance, childcare access, legal advocacy, the architecture of a genuine second start. She had been working on it for 11 months. She had wanted it to be hers before she shared it. She had wanted to be able to say, I built this, not with your money and your name and your network, with my own contacts and my own expertise and resources I assembled through my own effort. And when it was solid enough to stand on its own, I was going to tell you. I was going to show you something I made. She wrote about Daniel Reyes, 37 years old, gifted, doing the structural design work at rates far below market because he believed in the project and because Diane had been one of the few people in his professional life who had treated him as a serious architect rather than a promising kid. She wrote, I know what you thought. I know what it looked like. I know that you were watching from behind those glasses and building a story about what you saw, and I know that story was wrong. I want you to understand that the wrongness of that story is not a mistake you made from cruelty. It is a mistake you made from fear. And I know about fear. I know what it does to the way we see things. I am not here to convict you of your fear. I just need you to know what it cost. She wrote about the divorce attorney consultation. She wrote it directly, without softening. Yes, I spoke to a family law attorney. I want to tell you exactly why, because the real reason is more painful than the wrong reason you have probably already imagined. The real reason is this. I spent 3 months watching you construct and maintain an elaborate test of my character. I watched you perform helplessness you did not feel. I watched myself be monitored, in our home, in our marriage, by the person who was supposed to be my partner. And I began, in those 3 months, to consider what my life might look like if I could not stay. Not because I wanted to leave, because I needed to know that if I had to leave, I would be able to. And specifically, I needed to know that the foundation, the thing I was building for those women, the thing I built without using your resources, could not be taken from me in a divorce proceeding. I was protecting a nonprofit for abused women from the possibility that it might be caught in the crossfire of a marriage I was afraid might not survive your fear of me. I was not planning to leave you. I was planning to protect something that has nothing to do with us from the consequences of something that does. The letter ended with a question. For pages. All of it clear-eyed. All of it honest. All of it written in the handwriting of a woman who had made the choice to be known fully rather than to protect herself from the vulnerability of that. And at the bottom of the 4th page, the last line, I need to ask you something. Not as your wife. Not as the person you were testing. Not as anyone other than the person who has been in this house watching you be afraid, and has chosen, every single day for 3 months, to stay anyway. What did you find? When you watched me, not knowing I was watching you back? When you watched me when you thought you were finally seeing me clearly, what did you find? Marcus sat with the letter for a long time. Then he called Robert Garfield. He said, I found out exactly who she is. And I don't deserve her. He hung up the phone. He sat in his study for another hour. Then he went to find his wife. He found her in the garden. She was sitting in the chair she usually sat in when she wanted to think, near the far end of the property, where the landscaping gave way to a planted border that she had designed herself in their first year in the house, and where, on clear days, you could see a narrow slice of the Pacific between the cypress trees. She did not look up when he approached. He sat in the chair beside her. There were several minutes of silence. Not uncomfortable silence, or not only uncomfortable. The silence of two people who have just exchanged a great deal of truth and are not yet sure what to do with all of it. Marcus did not have a prepared speech. He had, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, arrived at a significant moment with nothing prepared. He said, "I owe you an apology that I don't think I know how to make yet." She said, "I know." He said, "The foundation is extraordinary." She turned and looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You read the whole thing." He said, "Twice." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I need you to understand something. The apology is not the hard part. People apologize. The hard part is the reason this happened and whether you actually understand what that reason is. Because if you think this was about Diane doing something suspicious and Marcus making a mistake, you've missed it. And if we stay in this marriage with you having missed it, we will end up here again." She was right. And Marcus, the man who had made his life on being right, knew she was right. Which is perhaps the clearest evidence we have that whatever was salvageable between them was, in fact, being salvaged in real time in that garden in Newport Beach on a Sunday morning in July of 2019. Because a different man, a lesser version of Marcus Hale, would have received that correction as an attack and responded accordingly. This version of Marcus Hale received it as the most important thing anyone had said to him in as long as he could remember. He said, "Tell me what I've missed." She said, "You were afraid I would leave. Not for someone else, not for money, just leave. Because you don't actually believe, at the deepest level, that you are worth staying for. And you designed an entire 6-month lie to test whether I would stay, without ever once considering that the more honest option was to tell me you were afraid." She paused. She said, "And here's what I need you to hear. I would have stayed. If you had said those words to me, 'I am afraid you will leave me,' I would have told you the same thing I am telling you now. Obviously, I'm here. I'm not leaving. But I needed you to be able to ask. And you couldn't ask. And that is the thing we have to fix. Not the glasses. Not the test. That. They went to therapy. Not immediately. There was a period of several weeks where they were simply two people in a large house with a great deal of recent history between them, navigating the specific awkwardness of that in the way that two intelligent, private adults navigate such things, carefully, with occasional missteps, with the occasional evening that went sideways and had to be repaired the following morning. But within 6 weeks of the Sunday in the garden, they were sitting together in the office of a therapist in Newport Beach named Dr. Carol Watkins, a woman who had spent 3 decades working with high-functioning couples and who, by her own careful account given later, found the Hale case among the most instructive she had encountered in her career. Not because it was the worst, but because the gap between what these two people were capable of and what their fear had made them do was so large and so clarifying. The work they did in that therapy is largely private, as it should be. But what Dr. Watkins was able to say, speaking in general and professional terms, was this. Both of them had spent their lives developing extraordinary competencies in the external world, professional, practical, intellectual, at the partial cost of a different kind of competency, the interior kind, the kind that allows a person to name what they feel and ask for what they need without the mediation of strategy. Both of them had arrived at middle age with significant emotional intelligence in some dimensions and significant blind spots in others. And both of them had, in their own distinct ways, during the 6 months of the test, demonstrated the deepest truth about themselves that they were perhaps capable of demonstrating. Diane had continued to care for a person she knew was lying to her, because she could not abandon someone in pain. Marcus had conducted surveillance of the person he loved most, because he could not bear to ask directly for reassurance. Neither of these is simply a flaw. Both of them are ways of being in the world that contain both gift and limitation. The work was to hold both things without collapsing into either the guilt or the justification. They stayed. They stayed in Newport Beach. They stayed in the marriage. They stayed in the therapy for over a year, weekly, and Marcus, who had spent his entire life processing everything alone, showed up every week with a consistency that Dr. Watkins later said was unusual in her experience of high-achieving men. He was a person who completed what he started. He had decided to do this properly, and he did it properly. Diane, for her part, continued building the foundation. Daniel Reyes completed the architectural designs on schedule. The legal filings moved forward. The four principals, Diane, Keisha, Barbara, and Sandra, met monthly, then weekly, as the project moved from planning to reality. Marcus, over the course of 2019 and into 2020, became increasingly involved, not as a controlling presence, not as the billionaire swooping in to take over a project that had been built without him, but in the supporting role that Diane had described in the letter. He contributed $2 million of his own money. He opened doors in his network that would have taken the foundation years to access on its own. Relationships with property owners, with city officials, with corporate partners who could provide the kind of sustained practical support that nonprofits require to function long-term. He did it, consistently, and in every account from those involved, in a way that made clear the project was Diane's. He was there to make it bigger, not to make it his. In September of 2020, the Hale Foundation for Transitional Housing opened its first facility in Compton, California. A building designed by Daniel Reyes, 47 units, warmly proportioned, flooded with natural light. Every detail oriented toward the specific dignity of women who had survived something and needed somewhere safe to begin again. Marcus Hale stood at the ribbon cutting in a September morning sun. No dark glasses, no white cane, clear-eyed in every sense, and shook hands with Daniel Reyes in a moment that was documented, quietly, by a photographer whose images would later surface alongside the larger story. Diane spoke at the ceremony. She thanked the people who had worked with her. She did not perform emotion. She simply stood up and told the truth about why she had built the thing and what she hoped it would be for the women who came through it. And she was, by every account of those who were there, extraordinary. The story did not become public because Marcus or Diane chose to share it. Both of them, by temperament and by the specific nature of what the story contained, had every reason to keep it private and showed every indication of intending to do exactly that. The story became public because of a member of their household staff, a woman who had worked at the Newport Beach estate for 2 years, whose employment was governed by a standard confidentiality agreement, and who, in the autumn of 2020, sold what she knew to a celebrity gossip publication for a fee that was later estimated, in the subsequent lawsuit, to have been in the range of $30,000. The publication ran a version of the story that was, as celebrity gossip stories tend to be, accurate in outline and considerably less nuanced in detail. The headline was sensational. The coverage was thin, but it was enough. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by every major media outlet in the country. By the end of the week, it had traveled internationally. The combination of elements, the billionaire, the beautiful wife, the fake blindness, the secret meetings, the hidden money, was exactly the kind of story that the internet, in its particular hunger for clear moral categories, received with enormous and immediate appetite. The legal response was swift. Marcus's team filed suit against the publication and against the former employee within 72 hours. The case would eventually be settled out of court, under terms that are confidential, but which those familiar with the matter suggest were significant. The employee's career in any position requiring discretion or access to private households was effectively ended. None of this slowed the public story down. The internet does not wait for legal resolution. What happened in the court of public opinion was, in some ways, the most revealing part of this entire story, not about Marcus and Diane, but about the rest of us. The discourse that erupted in the wake of the story's publication cleaved almost immediately along lines that had very little to do with the actual specifics of what Marcus and Diane had done and experienced, and almost everything to do with pre-existing frameworks that large numbers of people apply to stories about wealthy marriages, gender, money, and power. A substantial portion of the commentary identified Marcus as simply and straightforwardly abusive, a controlling man who had surveilled his wife for 6 months under false pretenses, who had used his resources and his access to monitor her behavior without her knowledge or consent. This position was not without merit. What Marcus did was, in the most direct possible description, a sustained deception in the service of surveillance. The fact that he was afraid did not change the nature of the action. Fear is not absolution. Another substantial portion of the commentary identified Diane as the villain, the wife who had been secretly moving money, secretly meeting with a younger man, secretly consulting divorce attorneys. This position operated on the version of the story that existed before the letter, before the foundation, before the full picture. It operated on the silhouette of a narrative that, once filled in with actual detail, looked entirely different. But silhouettes are easier to process than full pictures, and the internet rarely waits for the full picture to arrive before it renders judgment. A smaller, quieter portion of the commentary did something more interesting. It sat with the complexity. It asked what both of these things could be simultaneously true: a man who responded to love with surveillance, and a woman who responded to betrayal with sustained care, and what it meant that both of those things existed within a single marriage. It asked what both people had been afraid of, and what both people had done with their fear, and what the existence of those two parallel fear responses said about the ways all of us move through intimate life, often more strategically and less honestly than we would like to believe. This conversation was less loud than the others. It usually is. Marcus and Diane declined to speak publicly. They issued a single joint statement through Marcus's communications team, which read, in its entirety, "We are grateful for the support of our friends and family. The Foundation's work continues. We have nothing further to add." It was, given everything, a remarkably composed document. The communications team had reportedly lobbied for something longer, something that addressed the narrative more directly, something that managed the story more aggressively. Marcus and Diane had declined every suggested addition. The statement said what it needed to say. The Foundation's work continues. Everything else was private. The media frenzy lasted, in its acute phase, approximately 6 weeks. Stories of this kind have a metabolic rate. They spike, they plateau, they are displaced by the next thing. They settle into the longer tail of reference and retrospect. By the end of 2020, the Hale story had entered that longer tail. It still surfaces. It surfaces in conversations about privacy in marriage, about the ethics of testing the people you love, about the ways that wealth shapes and distorts the power dynamics of intimate relationships. It surfaces in conversations about domestic abuse and what it looks like when a person chooses to stay and care for someone who is, in some fundamental way, failing them. It surfaces in conversations about what the word loyalty actually means when you strip away the sentimentality and look at what it requires in practice. And it surfaces, invariably, in conversations about Diane Castillo Hale and the letter, because the letter became, in the way of things that are genuinely extraordinary, something larger than the story that contained it. Copies of it circulated online, leaked by someone, the source never definitively established, and it was read by millions of people who had no prior knowledge of Marcus and Diane and who encountered it simply as a document, for pages of a particular kind of clarity and courage, and found in it something that resonated in their own lives. Not because their lives resembled the Hale situation in its specifics, but because the thing the letter addressed, the gap between what we feel and what we say to the people we love, the distance between the protection we offer others and the protection we allow ourselves to receive, is not specific to one marriage in Newport Beach. It is the architecture of a problem as old as people. The Hale Foundation for Transitional Housing is, as of the time of this telling, operating 3 facilities across Southern California. The original Compton location has housed, in aggregate, more than 200 women and children. A second facility opened in East Los Angeles in 2022. A third, in Riverside County, opened in early 2024. The foundation has a full-time staff of 23 people and a volunteer network of over 200. It has received funding from major philanthropic institutions, several corporate partners, and a sustained base of individual donors, many of whom, by their own account, first heard of the foundation because of the story that became public in 2020 and found their way from curiosity about the marriage to genuine engagement with the work. Keisha Morris, the social worker who was one of the 4 original principals, now serves as the foundation's executive director. Barbara Ewan, the nonprofit attorney, continues to serve on the board. Sandra Porter, the community housing advocate, leads the foundation's policy and advocacy work at the state level. Daniel Reyes's architectural firm has grown substantially since the original Compton project, and his firm has been retained for the design of both subsequent facilities. He has spoken publicly, on a number of occasions, about the experience of working with Diane and what it taught him about the relationship between design and human dignity. He has never, in any public statement, addressed the specifics of what Marcus suspected about him. He has not needed to. Diane continues to run her interior design consultancy, now with a team of 8, with a particular focus in recent years on projects at the intersection of design and social impact. Healthcare facilities, community centers, educational spaces. She sits on the foundation's board and is involved in its strategic direction, though the day-to-day operation has been handed to Keisha and the staff she has built. She has given one public interview about the marriage situation, a long-form piece in a magazine in 2022, and what she said in that interview is largely consistent with the letter, which is to say honest about the difficulty and clear about what she chose and why. She said, "I stayed because I believed in him. Not in the performance he was giving me, not in the test he was running. I didn't believe in those at all. I believed in the person I had met, who had been good and was afraid. I stayed for that person. And I told myself that if I was wrong, if the person I believed in turned out not to be real, then I would know I had been wrong, and I would leave. I was not wrong." Marcus has, publicly, said very little. He gave a brief interview in 2021 to a business publication that asked about it peripherally, and his response was 3 sentences. "I made a serious mistake. I was fortunate that the person affected by that mistake was generous enough to give me the opportunity to address it. The rest is private." 3 sentences is, for Marcus Hale, an enormous disclosure. He means every word of it. People who know him well say that what the experience did to him, the 6 months of the performance, and more than that, the reading of the letter, and more than that, the sustained work of the therapy, the confrontation with what his fear had made him do, changed him in ways that are visible and real. He is, by multiple accounts, more present, more willing to say the things he previously would have managed rather than expressed. Still private, still controlled in the essential register of his character. That does not change, and perhaps should not, but differently available to the people he trusts. The clenching that had been there before Diane, and that had returned in the worst of the fear period, is not there in the same way anymore. He and Diane are still married. 7 years now, including the year of the test. They live in Newport Beach. They travel together and separately. They attend the foundation events together. People who see them together now describe something similar to what people described in the early period of the marriage: ease. Genuine ease. The particular ease of 2 people who have been through something significant together and come out of it with a clearer understanding of who the other person is, which is both harder to achieve and more durable than the ease that comes from not having been tested at all. There is one more detail that is worth including, not as a climax, but because it is true and because truth is the only thing worth telling at this point in a story this long. In early 2021, Marcus converted a portion of the Newport Beach Estate's ground floor into accessible residential space. A single self-contained apartment, designed with full accessibility features for the visually impaired. He donated the use of it to the foundation, which has since used it as transitional housing for women with disabilities who have particular housing access challenges. The apartment was, by multiple accounts, beautifully done. The design work was Diane's. But the accessibility features, the specific, detailed, expertly implemented adaptations for life without vision, Marcus had specified himself. He knew exactly what was needed. He had, after all, spent 3 weeks learning. Whether you read that as penance or as something less legible and perhaps more honest than penance, I will leave to you. It would be easy, at this point in the story, to offer a clean moral, a lesson, something portable and shareable that could be extracted from the complexity of what Marcus and Diane experienced and applied to other lives in other circumstances. People often want this from stories of this kind. They want the story to resolve into instruction. Here is what this means. Here is what you should take from it. Here is the cautionary tale, neatly labeled. I am not going to do that. Not because I don't believe the story contains things worth learning from. It contains more of those things than any single video can do justice to. But because the moment you reduce this story to a lesson, you lose the actual thing that makes it worth your time, which is not the lesson. It is the people. It is the specific, irreducible, complicated humanity of two adults who loved each other and were afraid and responded to their fear in ways that were deeply characteristic of who they each were and who found, on the other side of a great deal of pain and honesty, something more real than what they started with. Marcus Hale could not ask for what he needed. This is not unusual. In the research on how men in particular, and especially men who have built identities around competence and control, manage emotional vulnerability, the pattern of converting need into strategy is extraordinarily common. The need does not go away. It finds indirect expression. It becomes surveillance, or emotional withdrawal, or the construction of tests that allow the person to gather reassurance without ever admitting they needed it. Marcus's version of this was more elaborate than most, more resourced, more sustained, but it was not, at its root, different in kind from what millions of people do in smaller and quieter ways every day inside their own relationships. The fear of being left, the inability to simply say, I am afraid you will leave me. The elaborate architecture we build to avoid that simple sentence. Diane Castillo Hale knew for 3 months that her husband was lying to her. She chose not to say so. She chose instead to continue caring for him, continue building her foundation, continue tending the marriage in full knowledge of its most recent crisis, and to wait for him to choose truth on his own terms. She placed a letter on a counter, and she waited. There are people for whom this reads as weakness, as a woman subordinating her legitimate anger to a man's comfort, choosing to absorb rather than confront. I understand that reading, but I think it misses what Diane actually did, which was not passive at all. The letter was not passive. The letter was the most direct, most honest, most courageously confrontational document in this entire story. She did not confront him in the kitchen because she did not want to give him the opportunity to react from defense. She wanted him to receive the truth in full, without the option of managing it, on a piece of paper he could not interrupt. That was not weakness. That was strategy of a very different kind from Marcus's strategy, one oriented not toward gathering information but toward offering it, toward saying here is everything I know and everything I feel, and now I need to know what you will do with it. What she did was, in the specific sense of the word, shocking. Not because it was dramatic, but because it required a quality of moral courage that is genuinely rare. To know you are being deceived, and to choose not to make that deception the story, to choose instead to offer truth in the face of it, and wait for the person you love to come toward that truth on their own. that is not something most people do. Most people defend. Most people retaliate. Most people make the deception the story, because the deception is real and the anger it produces is real, and the anger is easier to live in than the sadness underneath it, which is the sadness of watching someone you love fail to trust you, and finding that you love them anyway, and not quite knowing what to do with that. Diane knew what to do with it. She put it in a letter. She put the letter on a counter, and she waited. There is something in that particular sequence of events, the decision to write it down rather than say it in the heat of the moment, the decision to leave it and wait rather than thrust it at him and demand response, the decision to give him the private space to receive it before he had to face her. That speaks to a quality of emotional intelligence that is not natural to most people, but is learnable. The therapists and researchers who have spent their careers studying what makes intimate relationships survive significant ruptures, the John Gottmans of the world, the attachment theorists, the practitioners who work daily in the space between people who have hurt each other and people who want to stay, will tell you that the single most consistently predictive factor in whether a relationship survives a crisis is not the severity of the crisis. It is the quality of the repair. And the quality of the repair depends almost entirely on whether both people are able, at some point, to tell the full truth and receive it without using it as a weapon. Marcus and Diane did that. Not immediately, not easily, not without the sustained support of a very good therapist and the quiet infrastructure of two people who had decided, despite everything, to try. But they did it. And the result, not the mansion, not the $4 billion, not even the foundation, though the foundation is real and matters enormously to the women it serves. The result that is worth noting is simply this: 7 years later, by every available account, they are still in the same room, still choosing each other, and doing it with more honesty than they started with. Whether that is enough, whether the test was forgivable, whether Diane should have left, or whether staying was the right choice, or whether there is such a thing as the right choice in a situation this human and this complicated. These are questions that belong to each of you, in the context of your own lives and your own experience of what love costs and what it is worth. I am not going to answer them for you, but I want to leave you with the image I keep returning to when I think about this story. It is not the mansion. It is not the dark glasses. It is not the moment Marcus walked into the kitchen without them. It is a kitchen counter, an envelope, a woman's handwriting on the front, and the decision, conscious, considered, brave in a way that does not look dramatic from the outside, but is, from the inside, one of the hardest things a person can do, to put the truth down somewhere the person you love will find it, and then to let them come to it in their own time. That is the image that stays. That is the heart of this story, not the test, the letter. And now, I want to hear from you. Because this story does not have a clean answer, and I believe the people watching this have more insight into it than they might realize. If you were Diane, knowing for 3 months that your husband was pretending, watching him watch you, tending to someone who was lying to your face, would you have written the letter? Would you have left? Would you have confronted him earlier? What would your version of that Sunday morning have looked like? Tell me in the comments. I read them. I want to know what you think, because this kind of story only becomes fully visible when many different people bring their own lives to it. And if this story reached something in you, if somewhere in the last 3 hours something in Marcus or Diane or the space between them landed in a way that felt personal, then you probably already know that next week's story is going to matter to you too. Because next week, I am telling the story of a woman who spent 8 years building a second life. Not to leave her marriage, not for another person, but to protect her husband from something he could never be told. And when the truth finally came out, the person who was most destroyed by it was not him. It was her. That story is coming. Make sure you're here for